So it's been at least 2 videos now since I've done a Star Wars build, and I'm starting to get that urge again. And it just so happens I've been sent a few samples from War Scenery's latest Kickstarter, so let's see if we can make something cool. So like I mentioned before, all of these pieces are from War Scenery's latest terrain pack, the Rebel Command Base. And if you hadn't guessed already, they've all been heavily influenced by scenery that you might find from the Battle of Hoth. And although all of this terrain has been designed with tabletop gaming in mind, I'd like to think I can put it all together to make a pretty cool looking diorama. And we're going to need to start out with a base, and an easy way to do that is to get a canvas board. It's a nice easy way of getting a consistent square base, and they're pretty cheap as well. And anything that can save me some time and some money is always a bonus.
Another happy landing.
And after cutting a few pieces of packing foam to size, I could then start to figure out the layout of this piece and lock in some of the landscape features. And I eventually decided on some small rocky outcrops in the corner that I could mount the turret on top of, and on the other side a small raised platform where the snowspeeder can sit. And because I'm not planning on using any sculptor mould on this piece, I needed to fill in a few of the gaps. And a really easy, effective way of doing this is just to use some scrunched up pieces of paper. You can use it to fill in all of the voids, and then use a few pieces of masking tape just to secure it all down into place. I even decided to go the extra mile and create a few more hills and slopes just to try and create a nicer transition from top to bottom. And once I was happy, I could then move on to the fascia. I used some heavy duty construction card for this and some double-sided tape and super glue just to hold everything in place. And then after one final test fit, I could move on to the next step, which was to strengthen all of the foam with some plaster cloth. This is a pretty old school way of doing things, but you know what they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Using plaster cloth like this is pretty quick and easy, but the main advantage is it dries really fast. It only took about 30 minutes or so for this to dry off really solidly, so that meant we were ready to move on to the next step, which was to mix up a small batch of sculptor mould.
Flashback.
And because I'm not planning on using any sculptor mould on this piece... Look, I know what I said, but sculptor mould was my only real option here because I had a few gaps to fill, so I'm sorry.
Liar!
But after a few hours or so, when everything had had a little time to dry, I was left with this really nice protective layer for all of the foam. And that meant it was time to move on to the next step and create those rocky outcrops. And my go-to for rocks in this situation is just a patch of casting plaster, mixed up to a fairly thick consistency. The plaster just gets applied to all the areas where you want your rocks, and as it starts to dry off, you can take a few tools and start to create some rock shapes. The key is to carve out all of the main rocky shapes while the plaster is still pretty wet. And then, once it's a little firmer, you can come in and add all your extra details like your cracks and your crevices. And after not too much time at all, you should be left with some fairly convincing rock faces. And at this point, I thought it might be a good idea to give everything that extra layer of protection. The paper in a few areas under the plaster cloth is a little more spongier than I'd like, so it was time to mix up a batch of terrain paste. This mix of plaster, black gesso and matte Mod Podge got applied over all of the surfaces where I used the plaster cloth, and just to be safe, I also decided to add it over the rocky outcrops. And once that had all had some time to dry, and I was happy after carrying out my strength tests, it was finally time to start adding some paint, starting with all of the rocks. And my go-to when it comes to painting generic rocks is to start out with a medium warm grey. Then I can introduce a few different brown tones and use a little bit of water to wet blend everything together. And once that first layer had dried, it was just a case of introducing some shadows into the recesses with a black acrylic ink. And at this point I'd normally say something like, and once I was happy, I moved on to the next step. But I wasn't really happy with this result, so I started again. And I started off by giving the rocks a zenithal highlight through the airbrush. Then I moved on to adding the same colours as before, but this time through the airbrush just so I got a smoother, more consistent result. Then I could work on those shadows again with a black wash, before finishing up with an off-white dry brush. And personally, I think they look 10 times better.
Great kid! Don't get cocky!
And then to try and give the walls of the trenches a little bit more of an icy look, I used a white base coat and then applied some turquoise acrylic ink to all of the recesses. I then followed this up with a little bit of blue tone from the army painter, just to try and create a little more contrast. I then finished off the rest of the trench details with a few different washes and speed paints. And with a few different metallics, I finished off some of the finer details. Then it was time to turn my attention to the 3D prints. And I thought it might be a cool idea to use some LED filaments to try and create an explosion effect coming from the turret. And I started by marking out the area that I needed to remove to house the filament and act as the battle damage. Then I used my soldering iron to roughly etch out the shape that I needed, and after a few passes, I could then remove this chunk of material and I was left with a pretty convincing hole. Then I could concentrate on getting everything painted, starting out with a black primer. Then it was on to giving everything a slight panel fade effect with some white primer, before adding a base coat of dungeon grey from the army painter. And then it was on to a few simple rounds of weathering. I used a few different enamel washes from AK just to blend in some dirt and grime and create a few streaks. And then with the airbrush I created some more shadows and recesses along with some more streaks on the snowspeeder. And then, once I was happy, I could then turn my attention to the inhabitants of this diorama. The guys at War Scenery were kind enough to send me a set of their Blizzard troopers to feature in this diorama. So while I give them a quick simple paint job, now seems to be a good time to let you know if you're interested in checking out any of these pieces for yourself. You can use the code CTDioramas20 to get 20% off your purchase when you check out in the War Scenery store. They have loads of awesome 3D printable models spanning from 40k to Star Wars Legion and a few bits and pieces in between. So to see everything else they have on offer, be sure to head over to warscenery.com. But now I had everything painted, I could start working on the explosion effect for the turret. And like I mentioned before, I'm going to be using one of these LED noodles. And I started by soldering in place the wires I needed to complete the circuit before threading them through the middle of the turret in a hole that I've drilled previously. And once I had all the wiring in place, I used a little dab of hot glue just to fix the filament down in a position that I thought looked good. The next job on the list was to diffuse some of the light and create the rest of the explosion using some polyester fibre. This stuff works great for jobs like this, but you just need to make sure you roll it all up into little balls and apply it in lots of separate pieces. That way you can apply all of your little balls in various layers until you're left with a fairly convincing look. And if you're feeling extra fancy, you can even go as far as gluing in place a few little pieces of debris. Then all I needed to do was layer up a few colours just to diffuse the light a little further, starting with the yellow speed paint and then working my way onto an orange and then finishing off with some black. And then once I'd awkwardly managed to thread the wires through to the bottom of the base, I could fix the turret permanently in place and finish off all of the wiring by adding in a switch and my battery pack. And with all of those jobs out of the way, it was on to arguably the most important part of any Hoth diorama, and that's the snow. And in this case, I'm going to be using some soft flake snow from Woodland Scenics. The snowflakes just get mixed in with some matte Mod Podge to create a pretty thick paste. This paste is eventually going to dry to give a really nice thick fluffy snow effect. And all I had to do was use my spatula to apply it in all of the areas I needed the snow. And then when it came to the rocks, I just sprinkled the snowflake over the top separately, and then locked it all into place with some scenic cement from Woodland Scenics. And while the paste was still wet, I could use it to glue down some extra pieces of scatter terrain, and of course, gave them that snowy treatment. And for one more added little extra, I decided to add some UV resin to the walls on the trenches, just to make it a little more shiny and give it that icy look. Then all that was left to do was make sure my troopers were securely down in place with a little bit of super glue, before moving on to tidying up the sides with some black gesso. And I think that means we're just about ready for some glamour shots. So that's about it for this one, and as always, thanks for taking the time out of your day to watch through this video. I really appreciate it. But for now, I'll see you in the next one.